I was standing in the hallway, holding a tray of freshly baked pumpkin muffins when I heard it. "She's not well. You can see it, can't you?" Amanda's voice carried from the living room. "I mean, she forgot my son's name last month," Michael chimed in. "It's getting worse." I froze, feet rooted to the hardwood floor just outside the archway that led into the room. "They didn't know I was there," David added. "It's time we make a decision. Mom needs professional care, a facility, before she hurts herself or someone else. Facility." My stomach twisted. They were talking about Helen, my mother, my only real family. "She's not your real mother." Amanda once spat at me years ago. That sentence still echoed in my mind from time to time, especially now, as I stood listening to them plan how to take everything away from her. And from me. I had been with Helen for 15 years, first as her caregiver, then legally adopted as her daughter when I turned 23. She took me in from a halfway shelter after I aged out of the foster system. She gave me a home safety dignity and something no one had given me before: unconditional love. She treated me like a daughter long before the paperwork made it official. And now her biological children, people who visited maybe twice a year and sent obligatory birthday cards, were plotting to declare her mentally incompetent. "Are you sure this will hold up in court?" Amanda asked. Michael replied, "Yes, I've already spoken to a lawyer. If we can show a pattern of decline, we can apply for guardianship. And once we have that, David said we can take control of her estate. Someone has to manage it. She's not capable anymore." They didn't see me step back into the hallway, hand trembling around the tray. My breath hitched. I forced myself to stay calm. They couldn't know I'd heard them. Not yet. That evening, I sat next to Helen as she watched a rerun of some black and white Western show. Her soft white hair was brushed neatly, her reading glasses perched at the tip of her nose. She held my hand. "You've always been the one who stayed Sarah," she whispered. "No matter what." I swallowed hard. "I love you," I said. "I love you too, baby." And as I kissed her forehead goodnight, I knew I couldn't let them do this to her. Not after everything she had given me. Not after the way they had used and neglected her. Later that night, I remembered the old safe in Helen's study, the one she never let anyone touch. Maybe there was something in there, something I could use to protect her. I made a plan. I would wait until morning, and I would find out exactly what she'd been hiding all these years. Because if her children wanted to take her away, they'd have to go through me first. Helen Montgomery was a woman of grace. Born in 1955, she spent most of her life as a school teacher in Vermont. She married, young, raised 3 children, Amanda, Michael, and David, and buried her husband after a long illness. To the outside world, she was the portrait of an American matriarch, composed, generous, strong-willed. But behind closed doors, Helen had always carried a quiet loneliness. Her children grew up and drifted away. They pursued careers in the city, sent postcards once in a while, and returned only when holidays required their presence. When her husband passed away, they returned briefly for the funeral, made vague promises to check in more, and disappeared again. Helen had no intention of becoming someone else's burden. She renewed her driver's license, paid her bills, cooked her meals, and even volunteered at the local library. But time caught up with her like it always does. When she fell in the garden one summer morning and fractured her wrist, she realized she could no longer live alone. That was when I came into her life. I was 23 and had just aged out of the foster care system. I'd been hopping between part-time jobs, sleeping in my car, and trying to figure out how to survive with no family, no degree, and no safety net. A social worker gave me a number to call Helen's number. She was looking for a live-in companion, someone to help with housework and errands. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, just temporary. But something changed the moment we met. Helen saw something in me I didn't even know was there. She didn't treat me like a project or a burden. She made space for me in her home and eventually in her heart. Within a year, she told me she wanted to adopt me. I laughed. I was an adult. "You're the only person I've ever called Mom," I said. "That's enough for me." But Helen insisted. "Let's make it legal," she said. so no one can tell you you don't belong. And she did. At age 24, I legally became Sarah Montgomery. The house we shared was modest, but warm, 2 stories wraparound porch, a big kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and lavender. Every morning I made her tea while she read the newspaper. Every evening I helped her change into her nightgown, rubbed lotion into her hands, and sat beside her until she fell asleep. We were a family. Except to Amanda, Michael, and David, I wasn't. To them, I was the helper, or mom's project. I was the reason they no longer had spare bedrooms in the house, the reason mom had changed her will, the reason things weren't like they used to be. At first, they ignored me. Then they resented me. Over the years, their resentment grew sharp and bitter. When they did visit, it was always for show Mother's Day brunches, where they brought flowers and left early holiday dinners, where they barely spoke to Helen birthday calls that lasted less than 2 minutes. Helen always forgave them. "They're busy," she would say, her voice tight but polite. "They have their own lives." But deep down, I knew it hurt her. Then 6 months ago, something changed. Helen started forgetting things. At first, it was harmless, a missed appointment, a misplaced set of keys, but slowly her confidence began to erode. She repeated stories, struggled to follow recipes she'd known for decades, and sometimes forgot what day it was. "I think I'm slipping, baby," she told me one night, her eyes welling with tears. "No, you're just tired," I said. "Everyone forgets things sometimes." But Amanda noticed too. During a brief visit in the spring, Helen called her by the wrong name only for a second, but it was enough. Amanda's face went stiff. Her next call was to a lawyer. Then came the conversations I overheard. The talk about guardianship, the accusations, the plan. They weren't trying to help her. They were trying to control her. Because Helen still owned her home. She had savings, a life insurance policy, a modest inheritance from her sister's estate. It wasn't millions, but it was enough to matter. And they wanted it. I tried confronting Amanda once, weeks before the Ta'an gathering. "You think I'm after her money?" I asked. Amanda's eyes were cold. "I think you've inserted yourself into a life you weren't invited into. You don't belong in that house. And you're certainly not family." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because I knew the truth. And so did Helen. Now, with Thanksgiving approaching and the tension rising, I started noticing other things. Documents on the kitchen table that had been moved. Helen's medical bills suddenly missing. Her insurance agent calling to confirm policy details Helen never updated. I was being slowly pushed out of her life by her own children. But the house was still hers. And there was still that safe in her study. Locked, old, untouched for years. I had once asked Helen what was inside. "Just papers," she said. "What kind of papers? The kind you only open when you absolutely have to." And now, standing in the doorway of her study while she napped upstairs, I realized this was that moment. Whatever her children were planning, I needed to get ahead of it. I needed something real, something solid, evidence, truth. So I stood in front of the safe. I placed my hand on the metal dial. I closed my eyes. And I entered her birthday. The dial clicked once, then again. And then, with one soft turn of the handle, the heavy door swung open. Inside, it wasn't chaos. It wasn't filled with dusty boxes or forgotten jewelry like I half expected. Everything was meticulously arranged. Folders with labeled tabs, a small lockbox, an envelope with a familiar gold-embossed seal. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. The first folder I pulled out was labeled Estate Planning, Updated. Inside was a new will, not a copy, the original, signed, notarized, and dated just 6 months earlier. In it, Helen left everything: the house, the savings, the investment accounts, the land behind the barn, to the person who has continuously cared for me, with honesty, compassion, and loyalty in the final chapter of my life. No name, just that sentence. But I knew what she meant, and so would anyone else who read it. My hands trembled as I reached for the second folder: letters. These were personal. Written in Helen's neat cursive, each letter addressed to a different person: Amanda, Michael, David, and one for me. I didn't open mine. Not yet. Not until I had to. Then I found something I hadn't expected. A thick envelope labeled confidential, adoption and DNA records. Inside were photocopies of an adoption certificate, not mine, but mine. There was also a DNA test from a private clinic dated 2 years ago. It compared Helen's DNA to mine, and the result 99.9% match. I sank into her desk chair. My legs had gone weak. I was her daughter, her biological daughter. How I skimmed the notes attached. Helen had included a small memo. In it, she explained, when she was 21, she had a child out of wedlock. Her parents, ashamed, forced her to give the baby up. She was told the girl had been adopted by a couple out of state. For decades, she never knew what became of her. But the first week I came to live with her, Helen saw something in my eyes, a resemblance, a connection. She began quietly collecting paperwork, a hairbrush, a toothbrush, a quiet DNA test behind my back. She hadn't told me because she didn't want to disrupt what we had built. She wanted to love me freely, whether I was her child by blood or not. But I was. That revelation alone would have changed everything. And yet, it was only the beginning. Because the next morning Amanda arrived, uninvited. She breezed into the kitchen like she still lived there. Her coat was expensive, her heels louder than necessary. "I need to speak to Mom," she said. "She's still asleep," I replied, standing between her and the hallway. "She's had a rough couple days. She'll be having rougher ones soon," Amanda muttered. I narrowed my eyes. "What does that mean?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It means we're not doing this anymore. Letting you play house while our mother declines under your supervision." Michael and I filed a petition for emergency guardianship. A state representative will be here this week to begin the process. "She doesn't need guardianship," I snapped. "You're not a doctor," Amanda said. "But you're not her caregiver." "I am." "No," she said coldly. "You're the one standing in the way of what's rightfully ours." That night, Helen sat quietly at the dining table. Her hands were folded, her expression unreadable. I told her everything about the safe, the will, the DNA test. She listened in silence. When I finished, she said softly, "So, you know, you knew I suspected. I hoped." We cried together for what was lost and for what we still had. Then I showed her the legal papers Amanda had left behind on the kitchen counter, the ones with the state seal, the petition to have her declared unable to manage her own affairs. Helen stared at the words as if they were in another language. "Am I losing my mind?" she asked me. "No," I said firmly. "You're under attack. We had a few days, maybe less. I needed more than emotions. I needed proof. Concrete, legal, indisputable proof." I went to the attic the next day and retrieved an old audio recorder Helen had used during her teaching years. Then I waited, because I knew Amanda would return. And when she did, she wouldn't be alone. On Thursday afternoon, she arrived with Michael and David, and a lawyer. I served coffee like a maid. I kept my face neutral. But I'd already pressed record and tucked the device into the corner bookshelf. They sat in the living room and began their carefully rehearsed speech. The lawyer explained the mental competency review. David played the role of concerned son. Amanda shed 2 calculated tears. Helen sat in her recliner, calm, silent. And then Michael said the sentence I'd hoped he'd say. "We just want to make sure the estate is handled correctly before things get worse," Amanda added. "We know Mom would want her assets divided equally among her children." That was it. The statement that betrayed their true motive. They left after an hour, satisfied that they'd set the plan in motion. But I had what I needed. I backed up the recording. I printed the will. I made copies of the DNA test. And I called Helen's longtime attorney, Mr. Elliot Kramer. He had retired 2 years ago, but when I mentioned Helen's name, he agreed to meet. I brought everything. I told him everything. When I finished, he said, "They'll challenge this." "I know," I said, "but I'll fight." He nodded. "Then let's give them a fight they'll never forget." Mr. Kramer's office hadn't changed much since the last time I'd been there with Helen years ago. Still lined with oak bookshelves, still smelled faintly of leather and dust, and still had that same steady hum of a small-town law firm, that had seen more family drama than the courthouse down the street. He reviewed the will slowly, his eyes squinting behind gold-rimmed glasses. Then he read the DNA report, flipping the pages back and forth. The audio transcript I had typed out sat in a neat stack beside his teacup. He didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, Helen knew exactly what she was doing. "She's always been careful," I said. "She was more than careful," he replied. "She was strategic. She knew they'd come for her." He stood and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner, pulling out a dusty red folder. "She updated the original will 2 years ago." "This? What you brought me? This is a final version she must have kept private. She didn't file it through our office, which is unusual for her. But given the circumstances..." "She was afraid," I said. He nodded. "And now it makes sense why." He sat back down and looked me in the eye. "You're going to need more than this. You'll need a witness, someone to confirm her mental state, preferably medical." "I can get that," I said. "Her family doctor is still practicing. He knows she's lucid." "Good. And that recording, it's damning. It proves motive. But we're going to file a preemptive motion to register this latest will and freeze the estate. That'll stall their guardianship claim." That night I drove home in silence. My mind spun with documents, legal options, what-ifs. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on, and Helen was waiting with 2 mugs of tea. She smiled when I stepped inside. "You always come back," she said. "Always." She took my hand and led me into the living room. There she handed me a small unopened envelope. "What's this?" "My letter to you," she said. "The one from the safe." I stared at it, heart thudding. She patted my hand. "Now is the right time." I opened it slowly. Her handwriting was graceful, deliberate. She had written it 6 months earlier. "My Sarah, if you're reading this, it means you found what I left for you. And maybe, just maybe, you found out the truth I always suspected. You are mine. I don't care what science says. I don't care what courts say. I knew the day I saw you in that shelter. I knew it when you brought me soup after my surgery. I knew it when you stayed up with me through the flu and never complained. You are my daughter, not because of blood, but because you chose me and I chose you. My children were born from my body, but you were born from my hope. If they try to take me away, protect me. Not for the money, not for the house, for what we are. I love you. Always. Mom." I read it again, then again, until the ink blurred. The next morning, the official letter from the court arrived. Amanda had filed for emergency guardianship. A court date had been set for Monday, 3 days away. I spent the weekend preparing, gathering witness statements, video clips of Helen cooking, reading, reciting phone numbers, current events. I called her doctor. He agreed to testify that she was still capable of managing her affairs. I printed bank statements showing no irregular activity, and I wrote a sworn affidavit detailing the confrontation, the safe, the documents, and the letter. But Sunday evening brought something I hadn't planned for. Amanda showed up again, this time with a police officer. "She's unstable," Amanda told the officer. "She's had memory issues, she's been aggressive. We're just trying to get her help." The officer turned to Helen. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Helen looked at me, confused but calm. "I'm fine. I've never been better." I stepped in. "Officer, there is a pending court hearing regarding guardianship. This is an intimidation tactic. Helen is not in any immediate danger, and this is still her private property." He looked unsure. Amanda scowled. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer," she snapped as she left. I closed the door behind them and locked it. Helen sank into her recliner. "They're desperate now," she said. I nodded. "Because they know they're losing." She looked at me quietly for a moment. "I don't want this to ruin you." "It won't. I don't want you to lose hope." "I haven't." Then she smiled. "You really are mine." Monday came too fast. In the courtroom, Amanda wore gray, the color of calculated grief. Michael looked smug. David kept his eyes down. I sat beside Helen, who wore the same lavender sweater she'd taught in for years. She looked radiant, calm, ready. The hearing began. Amanda's lawyer made the first argument that Helen had shown progressive cognitive decline, was being controlled by an unrelated caretaker, and was at risk of exploitation. When it was my turn, I rose slowly. "My name is Sarah Montgomery," I said, "legally adopted by Helen in 2009. But our relationship began long before that. I have lived with her, cared for her, cooked her meals, washed her laundry, managed her medication. I know her habits, her rhythms, her mind, and I know she is not incompetent." Then I handed over the will, the audio transcript, the DNA test, and the letter. The judge paused to read each item, then called Helen's doctor to the stand. He confirmed that she was in excellent mental health for her age and had no signs of dementia. Amanda's lawyer sputtered. "But the confusion?" The judge interrupted. "Confusion is not incompetence. An occasional forgetfulness is not legal cause for guardianship." Then he looked at Helen. "Beth Montgomery, do you wish to name anyone to help manage your affairs?" Helen straightened in her seat. "Yes, Your Honor, my daughter Sarah." The courtroom went still. "By law, she is already your legal daughter," the judge noted. Helen smiled. "Yes, but now everyone else knows it too." The judge ruled that the petition for guardianship was baseless. He ordered the will to be formally filed. Amanda, Michael, and David were instructed to cease all contact unless invited. The estate was frozen from interference. As we walked out of the courthouse, Helen took my hand. "It's over," she said. "No," I said softly. "It's just beginning." In the days following the court hearing, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. For a while, I thought we were done, that winning in court meant peace. But I underestimated how far people would go once they realized they had nothing left to lose. The legal notice arrived on a Friday morning tucked into a stack of junk mail. Amanda, Michael, and David were filing an appeal. This time not just to contest the will, but to accuse me of fraud, undue influence, and elder abuse. I sat in the kitchen, the letter trembling in my hands. Helen walked in and saw my face before I could speak. "What now?" she asked gently. "They're claiming I manipulated you," I said, "that I coerced you into changing the will, into cutting them out." Helen sat down across from me and reached for the letter. She read every word carefully, then folded it and placed it beside her cup of tea. "Let them try," she said. "We're ready." But I wasn't. Not fully. I called Mr. Kramer. He sighed when I explained. "They're doing what desperate people always do," he said, "throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks. Can they win? They can delay things, drain resources, but we have their motive recorded. We have the updated will, and we have the medical testimony. Still, this is going to take time." He paused, then added, "But Harold thought this might happen." I blinked. "Harold, your father." Helen's husband. Before he passed, he consulted with me quietly. He suspected the children would come after Helen eventually. He wanted to make sure she was protected. I didn't say anything, just listened. "There's a second file, one he left with me, to be opened only if the children challenged the estate or tried to declare her incompetent. Would you like to see it?" "Yes," I said, almost breathless. Later that afternoon, I returned to his office. He handed me a sealed envelope with Helen's name on the front in Harold's sharp slanted handwriting. Inside was a full financial audit, 15 years of bank transfers, receipts, emails, and transcripts. Harold had hired a private investigator a year before his death. He'd grown suspicious of his children's financial emergencies and began tracking everything. There were copies of emails from Amanda requesting money for a medical crisis while buying a new SUV the same week. Texts from David about unpaid student loans, followed by photos of him gambling in Atlantic City. Records showing Michael took out a business loan using Helen's name as collateral without her knowledge. Every lie, every betrayal, documented. But that wasn't all. There was a notarized letter from Harold himself. "To whomever is reading this, if my children are trying to take what does not belong to them, know this. I updated my estate with one goal: to protect my wife. If anyone attempts to challenge her, will claim guardianship or remove her from her home, they are to be immediately disqualified from inheriting anything. My wife and I built our life together. We earned every penny. and she has the right to decide what happens to it. My children may carry my name, but they do not carry my values. Sarah has done more for Helen in the last 10 years than any of them ever have. She is our legacy. Attached was a copy of an irrevocable clause built into Harold's trust. Any heir who challenges Helen's competency or the contents of her will forfeits all rights to the estate. My hands shook. "This is it," I whispered. Mr. Kramer smiled. "Yes, it is." Back at home, Helen sat by the window watching the birds outside. "They're not going to stop, are they?" she asked. "No," I said. "But Harold left us everything we need." I showed her the letter. She read it twice, then folded it slowly and held it to her chest. "He never stopped protecting me," she said. "That's because he loved you." She looked up at me, eyes full. "And I love you." We filed the letter and evidence into the court record. Amanda's appeal was officially countered. Weeks passed, then months. The court issued its final ruling in mid-spring. The challenge was dismissed. Helen's will stood. The estate belonged entirely to her, and any attempt to override it had now backfired. Amanda, Michael, and David were permanently barred from interfering with the estate. They were also disinherited. Helen received a formal apology from the court. And I became something I never thought I'd be. Free. Free from the shadow of always proving I belonged. Free from being just the caretaker. Free to be her daughter with nothing to prove to anyone. Helen and I began planning. We fixed up the old guest room, turned the attic into an art space. She started painting again, something she hadn't done since the 80s. I took long walks in the woods for the first time, not checking over my shoulder. One afternoon, while organizing old boxes in the basement, Helen found something wrapped in a blanket. It was a deed to the land next to our property, she said. Harold must have bought it years ago. The document was dated 5 years before his death, purchased under a holding company in Helen's name. There was a note for when she's ready to build something new. Helen turned to me. "Maybe it's time." "Time for what?" "For you to have something of your own." I blinked. "What do you mean I want you to build a home here?" "Your home. For your future. For the people you choose." I laughed a little breathless. "I don't know the first thing about building a house." She smiled. "Then I guess we'll learn together." We spent that summer sketching ideas, calling contractors, picking out paint colors, arguing over flooring. It wasn't perfect. There were still quiet days, still doctor's visits, still legal updates, and the occasional letter from one of her children never opened. But mostly there was peace, real peace, the kind you don't realize you've been craving until you finally taste it. And in that peace, something new began to grow. A life of our choosing. A family defined not by birthright, but by love. 6 months later, the house next door was nearly finished. It wasn't anything grand or flashy. 2 bedrooms, a small porch, a kitchen full of light, but it was mine. Every window, every doorknob, every board of cedar siding had been picked with care. I'd hired local builders, most of them people Helen had taught in elementary school. One of them brought her fresh blueberry muffins every time he came to work. Helen insisted on calling it Sarah's start, though I always smiled and replied, "It's still yours too." When I'd first come to her, I had nothing but 2 duffel bags and a broken phone. Now I had a home, a real one, with roots. The day we hung the front door, Helen stood in the yard holding a box wrapped in brown paper. "What's that?" I asked. "A housewarming gift." I opened it carefully. Inside was the yellowed first page of a picture book I used to read to her during her flu days. Tucked between the pages was a note in her handwriting. "You made me feel safe. I hope this home does the same for you." I cried on the spot. That night after dinner, we sat on the porch, watching the final touches go up, the painters brushing white around the windows, the porch swing being installed. Helen sipped her tea. The sun dipped below the hills like it always did in this part of Vermont, slowly, quietly, with a golden grace. "You were never supposed to stay," Helen said softly. "When you first came, I thought you'd be here a month or 2. I know, but every time you had a chance to leave, you stayed, even when it got hard." I looked over at her. Her eyes were glassy, but not with sadness. "With you," she continued, I didn't have to be someone I used to be. I could just be me. Old, soft, forgetful sometimes, but loved. You were never forgetful, I said. She smiled. You're a terrible liar. We both laughed. She took my hand. You know I used to believe family was something you were born into, that blood meant everything. But you rewrote that for me. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. Then she added, I think Harold saw it long before I did. I nodded. He protected us both. The guest room in my new house was the first space I decorated. I filled it with quilts Helen had made over the years, framed photos of the two of us, and a bookshelf lined with every novel we'd read aloud together. I wanted her to know she'd always have space, that her place in my life was permanent. One morning, I woke to find Helen already in the garden, wearing her sun hat, and humming the same tune she'd always sung while planting daisies. You're up early, I called. I wanted to beat the weeds. She crouched down and pulled at the soil with her gloved hands, the rising sun casting gold across her shoulders. I stood on the porch and watched her marveling at the simple joy of it all. No lawyers, no accusations, no pretending, just peace. But the past has a way of tapping on the shoulder when you least expect it. That afternoon, a letter came in the mail. No return address, just a postmark from Boston. I opened it reluctantly. Inside was a handwritten note from Amanda. Mom, I know you probably hate me. I don't blame you. I've started therapy. Real therapy. Not just the kind that teaches you to manipulate better. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I'm trying. And I'm sorry for everything. Amanda. I read it twice, then slid it back into the envelope. I showed it to Helen later that evening. She read it, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table beside her. Well, she said, that's a start. Are you going to write back? No. Ever, I don't know. She looked out the window. Forgiveness is hard, especially when they only say sorry after they lose. I didn't argue. We let the letter sit there for days. We never spoke of it again. But I knew it was still there beneath the surface. Like so many things mothers carry quietly. Around the same time, the county invited Helen to speak at a community event honoring educators. She declined at first, said her public speaking days were long gone. But I nudged her gently. You've got stories they should hear. She agreed. And on the evening of the event, she stood before a small crowd of familiar faces, former students, neighbors, friends, and shared the story of her life. She didn't mention the legal battles, not the betrayal, not the DNA test. Instead, she spoke about choices, about choosing to love people not because you have to, but because they've shown you who they really are. She ended her talk with a quote I'll never forget. Family is not something you inherit. It's something you build, one act of love at a time. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Later that night, I held her hand while we sat in the new living room fireplace crackling. I used to think I'd grow old alone, she said, that I'd just fade out quietly. I shook my head. You've never been quiet. You just needed someone to listen. She squeezed my hand. You gave me more than a home. You gave me back my voice. She fell asleep in the armchair that night, peaceful, warm, the soft blanket I'd made for her tucked under her chin. I sat beside her and watched her sleep, thinking about all the women like Helen out there, mothers, grandmothers, aunts, who'd been pushed aside, ignored, dismissed, and all the Sarahs, those who'd come into lives not by birth, but by love, and decided to stay. I thought about how close I came to losing her, how close we both came to being erased. But we weren't, because we'd fought back, together. A year passed, and still not a single day went by that I didn't thank the universe for her for the fight for the peace that followed. Life had settled into a rhythm. Mornings were slow and filled with coffee crossword puzzles and the smell of lemon soap. Afternoons often involved gardening, light cooking, and laughter that echoed through both houses. Evenings were for stories, old family tales Helen finally felt ready to tell, now that she knew I wasn't going anywhere. The legal battles had ended months ago. The estate was secure, no more threats, no more letters from attorneys. Amanda, Michael, and David had faded out like a storm that never returned. Occasionally, Helen would get a birthday card from one of them, signed, "Love with no return address." She always read them in silence, then tucked them into a drawer without comment. She wasn't bitter, just finished. We were building something else now. In the new house, I converted the second bedroom into a quiet studio. Not for art, for care. I'd begun inviting in a few local women widows, older neighbors, women in transition. We drank tea, talked, held space for grief and for growth. I didn't call it therapy, it was just being together, something too many people underestimate. One day, Helen surprised me by walking in during one of those gatherings. She carried a tin of fresh cookies and sat down without a word. The women welcomed her as though she'd always belonged there. Because she did. That afternoon, she told the group the story of her first year teaching, how she'd almost quit, how one child's hug kept her going. I watched her speak, her voice strong and full of life, and I realized something important. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And so was I. We planted an apple tree between our two homes that spring. We called it the Start-Over Tree. Helen said, "Every time it blooms, we'll remember we got to begin again." And it did bloom delicate white flowers that filled the air with sweetness. Bees danced in its branches. Children from the neighborhood came to pick the fruit in late summer. The tree grew strong, like we did. In the fall, I took Helen to the ocean. She'd mentioned once years ago that she hadn't seen it since before her husband died. She stood barefoot in the surf wind in her white hair, eyes closed. "This is what freedom feels like," she said, just loud enough for me to hear. We stayed until the sun dropped beneath the horizon, then drove home in silence, her hand resting gently over mine the entire way. That winter, Helen began slowing down more than usual. She still smiled, still told her stories, but she got tired quickly. She had more doctor's visits. Some days she needed help with buttons with steps. Still sharp as ever mentally, but her body, like all bodies, was reminding her that time was finite. She never complained. She simply said, "This body's been good to me. It's just ready to rest." One night she asked me to sit with her by the fireplace. We didn't turn on the lights. Just let the flicker of flame wash over the room in gold. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You were the greatest surprise of my life." I couldn't speak. I just nodded, throat too tight to form words. "If they ever come back," she added, "and I'm not here, you don't owe them anything. I know, but if you choose to forgive them, let it be for your sake, not theirs. I promised." She reached into her sweater pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. "This is for after." I didn't want to open it, but I did. It was a letter, short, simple. "My dearest Sarah, thank you for being the daughter I always dreamed of. Thank you for fighting for me when I couldn't. Thank you for making my last chapter one filled with love instead of fear. You were my home. Love, Mom." She passed away 3 months later, in her sleep, peacefully, in her own bed with my hand in hers. The funeral was small, just as she'd wanted. Friends, former students, neighbors. People stood up and shared stories. Some were funny, some brought tears. All of them spoke of a woman who gave more than she ever asked for. Amanda didn't come. Neither did Michael or David. I didn't expect them to. But I did send each of them a copy of her last letter to me, typed out unsigned. I didn't include a note. I didn't need to. Closure doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like silence, like a boundary held, like walking forward without waiting for someone to follow. After the funeral, I sat on the porch with a mug of her favorite cinnamon tea, staring at the Start-Over Tree. It was bare branches like fingers against the winter sky, but spring would come, and it would bloom again. I moved into Helen's house that year, my house now. The guest room became a reading room. Her favorite chair stayed by the window. I kept her handwriting on the fridge. I never stopped talking to her. Some days I'd still hear her voice in my head. "Add a little more garlic, don't forget the keys, stop doubting yourself, and always I love you." I've learned that blood doesn't make someone your family. Choice does. Action does, presence does. I've learned that you can be rewritten in someone's story, not as an outsider, not as a footnote, but as the main character. I've learned that love is louder than inheritance, stronger than betrayal, and longer lasting than loss. To anyone listening to this story now, if you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong, let me tell you something you do. Find the people who choose you, choose them back, and never ever underestimate the power of simply showing up. Because sometimes showing up is what saves someone's life, and sometimes it saves yours.